Great. Good morning. I'm also a little jet lagged, but I'm trying to get on local time. Hopefully I wasn't out too late last night. I'm going to talk a little bit about building venture capital ecosystems, or building startup ecosystems. I think I saw hands before. How many people consider themselves entrepreneurs in the audience? Okay, you guys are crazy. How many people consider yourselves angel investors or investors, venture capitalists in the audience? Okay, not so many. So when I keep coming back to Turkey, I'm going to keep answering that question, and I want to see more and more hands come up. So one of the challenges about investing in international markets is there's not as many angel investors as there are back in Silicon Valley. In Silicon Valley, we have a lot of people who've been in startup companies, people who are professional investors, people who are amateur investors. We're surrounded by people who are doing angel investing or even professional investing. When I was working at PayPal, I got started by watching Reid Hoffman and Peter Thiel, who I used to work with, do angel investing, and I got to invest with Ron Conway and some other folks. But I want to instill upon you the idea that actually investing in startups isn't that hard. You will probably lose your money on most of your investments, but if you're lucky, you might make money on a few. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the landscape and changes in tech and VC and why I think the market opportunity for investing in startups is great, not just in Silicon Valley, but around the world, and particularly about how to do what I call lean VC or quantitative venture capital, and then how that relates to building startup ecosystems and how that's relevant globally. Brief background on me, I started out as a geek and an engineer. I was a programmer and database analyst about 25 years ago. I sort of stumbled into doing my own company. I don't want to say it was a startup because we were doing consulting businesses, but I had dabbled a little bit in what a startup was about. Had a very desperately small acquisition out of that, less than $1 million, but I got a small win. And then ended up working at PayPal in 2001 to 2004, and then starting to invest in some companies after that, and eventually found my way into venture capital. Along the way, I had the chance to invest in a bunch of really amazing companies, and a few of them have been successful. What is 500 Startups? We're a venture capital fund and a startup accelerator. We are mostly in California, in Silicon Valley, about 35 people now, but about 10 of the folks in our company are actually in 5 or 6 other countries around the world. Our team speaks about 20 languages. We invest pretty heavily outside the US. That's quite unusual for a Silicon Valley investor. Probably about 25 to 30% of our investments are now outside the US, over a couple hundred companies around the world. We have over 2,000 founders in our network and a lot of mentors as well. The point that I want to make about that is not really to brag, but just that I think going forward, a lot of venture capital investing is not going to be done as much by people in suits who are doing due diligence looking at your companies. A lot more investing is going to be done through a network of entrepreneurs and people who are already successful in the area, just pinpointing the next generation and help bringing them up. So most of our investments, while we do go through a process for evaluating them, most of them are coming from our existing network of mentors and founders and people who are recommending companies. So I think of it more like a guild-based way of developing entrepreneurs and selecting entrepreneurs as well. I won't get into all the companies, but like I said, we've done a lot of investments, over 800. I think the stat was a little inflated on the exits, probably only about 30 or 40 so far. And like I said, we're all over the world. We've done investments in probably 40 countries, at least 5 or 6 geographies where we're very active, particularly Brazil, Mexico, in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, and in India. And we're starting to build a presence here in the Middle East. We've done about 12 investments in the Arabic-speaking market, and 1 here in Turkey, although I hope to increase that in the near future. All right, so that's the quick commercial. So some things that have changed over the last 15 years or so. One's pretty obvious. The cost of building companies has come down quite considerably, probably at least 2 orders of magnitude. Things that used to cost $5 million to build in maybe a couple years, then cost $500,000, and now you could argue at least the early stages of company building might be done in $50,000 to $250,000, or let's say roughly 6 months and 2.5 people. That's kind of the framework for how I think initial experimentation is done. So depending on what market and geography you're in, the cost of 2.5 people for 6 months might be as much as $100,000, as little as $10,000. But for a very small amount of capital getting going, you can build a lot of interesting experiments. that's not going to be the whole portion of building the company, but building the initial stages of the product and doing some customer testing. What's probably even more interesting than that is really just the fact that we've got a lot more people online. Probably, again, an order of magnitude increase, maybe even 2 orders of magnitude increase. And the last piece of that is really that monetization is getting easier, although that's not complete yet. So we have lots of reduction in cost in building software companies, lots more people online, and to some extent better monetization, although still some work to be done there. And then we have some other things such as the lean startup movement, growth hacking, and some other techniques that I think are allowing entrepreneurs to be more successful. However, we still fail most of the time. Now, I don't mean to say that to be depressing. I just want to state that as a fact. Most of you who raised your hand, most of you entrepreneurs, you're going to fail. Probably a third of you will fail very quickly, and another third of you will fail very slowly, and maybe a third of you might be successful at some extent, but from my greedy, blood-sucking venture capitalist perspective, probably only 5 to 10% of you will really matter to me, economically speaking. Now, of course, you're all beautiful people, and I love you, and you all matter to me. But when I say I believe in you as an entrepreneur, what I'm really saying is I actually probably believe in about 1 out of 10 of you. So go out there and try really hard, and one of you might really be successful. A few other things are also helping the prospects of entrepreneurs. One is that M&A, or merger and acquisition activity, is becoming a lot more frequent, particularly in the US and China markets, but even in other places as well, and I think that will accelerate over the future. Other things like funding platforms also are really interesting. So let's just kind of review the things that are really important here. Is less capital required to build companies, or at least to build product experiments, let's say. There are more customers online, particularly on online platforms, and it's easier and easier to get those users and customers to try out your products. And then there's lots of other ways to get capital and build businesses, whether that's accelerators, angel investors, or just you reading on TechCrunch or other like services online. A lot more information is available to entrepreneurs all over the world, whether or not you're in Silicon Valley. Those things make it easier for entrepreneurs to succeed. In particular, if we look at how companies were built maybe 15 years ago, before the first dot-com crash around 2000, some of you may have even forgotten there was a previous dot-com crash around 2000. I actually lived through that. And then the more recent one in 2008. Now, none of those were really technology crashes. Actually, most of those were financial market dislocations. In the second case, particularly real estate financial market locations that had blowover and impact on the technology world. But looking at that before what I call the big fat dinosaur startup stage, so millions of dollars in hardware and software infrastructure and maybe even hosting infrastructure to get companies off the ground, possibly several years of product development cycles, relatively concentrated places to raise capital, so you probably couldn't get a lot of money unless you were in Silicon Valley or in Boston or a few other places. And not very many people online. So really a lot of challenges in those environments if you compare them to kind of what's going on now and maybe in the last 5 years. So most of our costs really are headcount. We're not spending a lot of money on servers. We're not spending a lot of money on software. Most of our services are in the cloud. All these other layers of infrastructure that have been built that we are coming from Google and Facebook and Amazon and other services. So really we can like stitch these pieces together quite quickly, build product experiments, roll them out in maybe like weeks, possibly even days, and begin testing with hundreds of millions, possibly even billions of people online. That cost and time framework has just like dramatically reduced 1, maybe even 2 orders of magnitude. And our sources of capital, although they're not everywhere, are much more available now, not just in Silicon Valley, in plenty of metros in the US and plenty of metros around the world. And I call this the lean little cockroach startup phase. Cockroach in that they will survive, hopefully, even nuclear explosions. So now, if you think about those two worlds, really just 10 or 15 years difference, and how much easier it is to build companies online. I go to places, I probably visit 20, 30 countries around the world every year, and I hear people complain about how hard it is to not be in Silicon Valley. Even in the US, I hear about people in like Cleveland or maybe Chicago, like, oh, I'm not in Silicon Valley, I don't get Silicon Valley investors or valuations, or I'm not really around the talent. It's such a load of bullshit. It is such a load of bullshit because 15 years ago in Silicon Valley, it was hard as hell to build a startup. It was 100 times as expensive. There were 10 times fewer people. It took you all this time. And people were enthusiastic and crazy in Silicon Valley. Any place in the world is easier to build a startup now than 15 years ago in Silicon Valley. Any place in the world. So shut up and stop whining. Stop whining about lack of access to capital, lack of access to investors or talent, and build your fucking startups. It's easy. Well, it's not really easy, but it's a lot easier. If you look at those two situations, it is much, much easier to build startups anywhere than it ever has been before. This does not mean that you are going to be a billionaire. And again, most of you will fail. But it is easier now than it ever has been before to build a startup. If we think about where we're going to get customers now, all these logos up here, I bet you most of you probably know those logos on the right. Most people in the US, 3 years ago, they didn't know any of those logos on the right. WeChat, WhatsApp, Line, and Kakao. These are messaging platforms that are probably less than 3 to 5 years old. They all have hundreds of millions of users. In the case of WhatsApp, bought for $19 billion by Mark Zuckerberg. 10% of the market cap of Facebook went to buying that product, which didn't exist 3 to 5 years ago and had relatively little revenues. Hundreds of millions of users. WeChat, we actually use WeChat on our team because we have a team member in China, used by 400 or 500 million people, not just in China now as well. So those platforms, content platforms, video platforms, mobile and application platforms, all these things, really, the last 5 or 10 years, they did not exist before. And now hundreds of millions, if not billions, of people are using these products. Why is that interesting? Because for you as entrepreneurs, you can now reach those customers. Those are your channels of customer acquisition. I'm not suggesting that you are going to build the next Facebook, the next Instagram, the next WeChat. What I'm saying is that from these 5 to 10 global 100 million user platforms, you can acquire customers. Hopefully, you can acquire customers predictably and analytically in such a way that you know what the cost is to get those customers and what the conversion rates are to using your products. AngelList, a platform that, again, didn't really exist 3, 4 years ago. Absolutely changing the face of the game, not just in Silicon Valley, but all around the world. For all of you who raised your hand, who said you were entrepreneurs, you should all have profiles on AngelList. Now, not all of your investors may be looking on AngelList, but we found companies all over the world on AngelList. We invested in a company out of Croatia called Farmeron that was building web analytics for dairy farmers. Web analytics for dairy farmers. Cows in the cloud. That company was started by the son of a dairy farmer whose father needed to figure out dairy farm milk production for cows. They needed someone, and they didn't want to do that in spreadsheets. They wanted to have a web-based product, collect that data, and be able to measure it. They were paying, literally hundreds, if not maybe even thousands of dollars a month to manage productivity. Now that may not seem very exciting to you, but dairy farmers are all over the world. And a company in Croatia could be discovered by investors in Europe and the US because of their visibility on AngelList. That company subsequently went on to raise money in London from Seed Camp, in the US from us at 500 Startups, then later from Softtech Capital. They raised over $5 million now. So a geek who was the son of a dairy farmer in Croatia raised millions of dollars on a platform called AngelList. That's changing the world. So let's look at what we're thinking about when we're talking about venture capital. Many of you have heard of lean startup and applying lean startup principles to building your startups. I'm trying to do that for venture capital. One of the things that we think about when we're doing investments is that we're going to be wrong a lot. Probably about 60 to 80% of the time, we're going to be wrong. Now, what do I mean by wrong? I mean we're probably not going to get a great return on that investment. 50% of the time, we're going to get a 0 return on that investment. Maybe 20 to 30% of the time, we might get a 1x or less than 1x return on that investment. But perhaps 20% of the time, we might get an interesting return, and maybe 5 to 10% of the time, we get a really great return. Now, what does that logically suggest? If 50 to 80% of your investments are going to go to 0 or 1, and only 5 to 20% of them might make money, what should you do? Well, you should probably make more than one investment. You should probably make more than 5 investments. In fact, you should probably make more than 10 investments. If your chances of a great win happen 5% of the time when you're only making 20 investments, you got a 50-50 chance of getting that one big winner. Well, maybe you should invest in 500 startups. Maybe then you'll actually have a predictable model for when you're going to get those absolute outliers. But you want to give them a little bit of money. So the great thing was we just talked about how the reduction in cost in building startups makes it much easier to do those initial product experiments. So if I'm going to fail a lot, let's not fail spending $5 million. Let's not fail spending $500,000. Let's maybe fail spending $50,000. Let's do 100 experiments at $50,000, 70 of which fail, 30 of which work. Of those 30 that work, then take maybe $500,000 for those 30 that work. Of those 30 that sort of work, probably only 10 will eventually be interesting. Of those, maybe then we put the $5 million into those 10. This is a much more scientific principle and measured way of investing in startups. Now, people tell me that what I do is throwing darts at a dartboard and that I'm basically a gambler and I'm not doing enough due diligence. And I tell them, bullshit, you are the gambler. You are making 10 bets and expecting that one of them is going to be a $1 billion outcome. I'm going to make 500 bets, and probably at least 25 to 50 of them might be $100 million outcomes, and probably 50, maybe even more, might be $10 million outcomes. Furthermore, I'm going to impact the overall startup ecosystem much more significantly by making those lots of little bets. I'm going to have a very measurable and effective model for building startup ecosystems and seeing predictable success. So I call that lots of little bets. I'm stealing that from Peter Sims. And what this basically just means is we're going to have a portfolio of at least 200 companies every fund. We're probably aiming for more like 400 now. And again, we're going to expect that 60 to 80% of those probably fail or aren't very interesting. Maybe about 20 to 30% of them will write a second check. Perhaps half of those will write a third check. And if we're lucky, again, maybe 5% of our portfolio might get to 20x or better outcomes. Hopefully, more like 15 to 20% will become interesting. But it's highly asymmetric, and most things fail. So when we think about how we're going to start with that, we're going to start with a lot of little experiments. We're going to do mostly initially product testing and user testing experiments. Then we're going to do market testing and some revenue testing experiments. And then we're going to emphasize growth. So product, market, and revenue. And if we can cheat a little bit, we might even expect that the entrepreneur is going to do the product testing on their own budget and on their own hustle. And we won't even have to pay for that part of it. So what does that look like? Product validation and customer usage. First stage, probably maybe even $0, but let's say $25,000 to $100,000, or again, 6 months for 2.5 people. We're trying to validate a basic experiment of interesting functionality that some people will pay for. And I'm getting the hook here soon. So that idea is really just validate that something is interesting and some people will use it and hopefully pay for it. Might fail a lot of the time, but some of those will succeed. If I get to the next stage, now I'm going to flip to market testing and perhaps revenue testing. Now I want to see how big that market opportunity is, how much it costs to acquire those customers, and start to build some kind of financial model for how much revenue might be generated. If I can start to show that people will use this at scale or pay for its scale, and that maybe I can generate a predictable model for customer acquisition, then I'll advance to the next stage, and now we're talking about real venture capital and millions of dollars and starting to do it. So product, market, revenue, and this ability to sort of see through stages. Building product, testing market and customer acquisition, and then testing scalable growth. That's basically all what we're doing, and we're kind of doing that in measured fashion. I want to wrap up 2 more things and then finish. So when we think about what Silicon Valley really is, Silicon Valley is not a place. Silicon Valley is really state of mind, and that state of mind is belief and optimism in the face of failure. Belief and optimism in the face of failure. What I said before, 80% of you probably going to fail. But what's interesting is still in Silicon Valley, people are crazy enough to believe that someone's going to be succeeding. Hopefully it's me. Hopefully it's not that other guy. That's me. And that we all have this sustained illusion of success. Now, again, most things fail, but some of us are going to succeed. That's what's critical in Silicon Valley. Everybody's right about failure. It is easy to be right about the failure of people and startups. It is not so easy to have sustained disbelief knowing that 80% of things are going to fail, 90% of things are going to fail. So other things that are important: people, infrastructure, product, customers, whatever. But most important, that belief in success. And at least in Silicon Valley, we've got decades of experience seeing that unusual success result in unusual outcomes. So if you think about startup ecosystems, this is kind of how we think about it, starting with 1,000 bootstrap startups. Maybe a third of those get to an accelerator stage. A third of those get to seed stage. If eventually you get to maybe 1 to 3 mature companies, one of the previous speakers was talking about Turkish IPOs. The way you get to one Turkish IPO is 1,000 crazy, stupid, bootstrapped entrepreneurs, starting at the beginning, and then each of those stages proceeding. These numbers are not exact, but they're at least according to scale. But it takes money to get those 1,000 startups off the ground, at least at the seed stage and accelerator stage. So what's needed then are angel investors and seed funds. And entrepreneurs, probably there's a lot of things that entrepreneurs need to do, business plans not being one of them. But most of these things are now pretty available. In most economies around the world, the consistent complaint I hear from investors is our entrepreneurs are not good enough, they're not talented enough, they're not as good as Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. Again, I say bullshit. That is not true. Talent in the entrepreneurial stage is probably equally spread around the world. They just might not have as much exposure or experience to the success metrics in Silicon Valley, but they will get there. What is far less common is the investor side. Actually, it is the investor side which is usually the limiting factor and bottleneck in economic success around the world. The investors are too risk-averse. The investors do not know enough about technology. The investors are not active enough. The investors are not as good as Silicon Valley. The entrepreneurs are just as good as every place around the world. It is the investors that need to learn what's going on. They are the limiting factor. They are the point of failure. Do you get that? Wait, don't clap. Don't clap. Everybody who's clapping, you should be writing a check next year. Don't clap. Put it to use. The investor side is the limiting factor in growth of those markets. Hasan Aslanova has changed a country. Individually, one person has changed a country with a reasonable amount of money, but a relatively small amount of money for a country. $30 million, 30 investments, 1 or 2 years. He has changed an entire startup ecosystem for a country of 80 million people. And other folks in the market. Ahu Serter, a very successful female entrepreneur, starting to promote women founders and women angel investors. These are the type of people that we need. People who are actively supporting the entrepreneurial market and willing to put multiple investments into the ground and change how things are working. And most bankers and most other real estate investors do not understand how this works. Real estate investors are not going to be very good at startup investing because most of the time, real estate increases in value. Most of the time, tech investments fail. You cannot be successful as a tech investor applying real estate economics to the tech startup market. Most real estate investments appreciate measurably, slowly over a period of years. Most startup investments fail, but some of them rocket to the top. So a portfolio approach, probably 20 or more investments are absolutely required for that approach. I'm stealing like incredible amounts of time, but what I'm saying is very powerful, and I want to make sure you understand what I'm talking about, particularly the folks from the bank who I sat with at dinner last night, and I'm talking about changing the country. You folks, I hope you're listening to what I'm saying, because what I want you to do is I want you to help angel investors and help small seed funds get started in Turkey, and that's what's changing the market. You've got plenty of talented entrepreneurs here. You just need to give them money. Okay, lastly, just one thing on global entrepreneurship. There's startups and entrepreneurs all over the world. Things that we think are interesting, in particular, English, Chinese, Arabic, and Spanish markets. Turkey's a big market by itself, but you're also surrounded by a lot of Arabic speakers. I would suggest for a lot of Turkish entrepreneurs, start locally, but then look at the Arabic-speaking market and the rest of the world as opportunities. There's not very many people pay attention to the Arabic-speaking market, and it's huge and a great opportunity. Lastly, you won't be able to read this slide, but my belief is there are millions of interesting startup businesses to invest in every year. Again, the limiting factor to those million talented entrepreneurs, investors to give them money. We talk about 500 startups and that being our goal. We've already invested in 800 companies. 500 startups is no longer my goal. My goal is 500 VCs. Maybe 5,000 VCs. I want to fund 100,000 startups a year. How do I do that? I probably need about 5,000 people writing checks. Now, that may sound like an outlandish number, but it's really not that hard. There are plenty of companies that are 5,000 to 10,000 people. I want to build one about investors so that we can open up the market for all the innovation and economic opportunity that's capable in entrepreneurs around the world. I hope you'll join me in that battle. Thank you.